Welcome back, everyone. We've learned a lot of Hebrew in what I've been calling the Vayomer Elohim way, just by hearing it and starting to say it ourselves, the way we all learned our native languages. We've also been gradually building up our stock of things that we not only understand, but theoretically, you could explain in detail to someone else, not just words and phrases, but more abstract grammatical knowledge. For example, that the im ending of Elohim is normally a plural ending, but that it can be used for a singular noun when that noun describes lordship, ownership, or mastership. You know that the various parts of speech have to agree with one another. That is, they have to match in gender and number, and sometimes in person, first, second, or third. So in the phrase Elohim Acherim, the adjective Acherim is masculine plural, and that tells us that Elohim must be a plural noun here. So Elohim Acherim are other gods in the plural. But Vayomer is a singular verb. In fact, it's third person masculine singular. So Vayomer Elohim must be using Elohim in that plural of majesty, and God with a capital G said. The verb is singular, so Elohim must also be singular here. We've learned that adjectives have both gender and number, which means every adjective has four forms: masculine or feminine, singular or plural, tov, tova, tovim, tovot. And we've learned that nouns can end with im or ot in the plural, but not be what that ending makes you think. Example number one, Elohim. Not masculine plural, but 99% of the time, masculine singular. Example number two, the word Isha, a woman, feminine singular, but do you remember the plural of Isha? Nashim, with an im ending. And an adjective has to agree with the real gender of the word, not what the ending looks like. So good women are Nashim Tovot, feminine plural. A big city, Ir Gdolah, plural, Arim Gdolot. And we've also learned the pronominal suffixes. You didn't think I was going to forget those, did you? My little brother, Achi HaKaton. He's masculine, he's singular, that's katon, but he's also definite. He's my brother. And an attributive adjective, an adjective that modifies the noun, has to match it in gender, number, and definiteness. So it's Achi HaKaton, my little brother. All these things are basic in Hebrew, the kind of thing we know instinctively in our own languages. Even if it sometimes takes a little bit of negotiation, verbs, nouns, and adjectives all have to agree. They have to agree with each other grammatically. That's how words behave. But how do letters behave? That's going to be the subject of this lecture. So let me explain why. Next time, we're going to learn the two forms of the verb that have person, gender, and number, like Vayomer, third masculine singular. But we're going to learn those forms systematically and start building up our scientific knowledge, if I can put it that way, of the Hebrew verb. And Hebrew verbs are very, very regular. I've said this before, learn the patterns and you don't have to learn 501 Hebrew verbs. Just replace the root and use the same patterns over and over again. I said it, but you may not believe it, because just about every verb we've encountered has probably sounded different to you. Most of that difference is because Hebrew has a lot of consonants that don't believe in go along and get along. Unlike verbs, nouns, and adjectives, some of the consonants would rather say, let's do it my way. We've seen a lot of these behaviors already, but this time I want to discuss them comprehensively. You'll find a complete list of them in the course guidebook, and you may want to bookmark it. Because the sooner you understand the peculiarities that certain consonants insist on, the sooner you'll be able to spot the patterns that certain categories of verbs repeat. And the reason you want to learn to do that is so that you can decipher words that you don't recognize. This is a skill you need to develop on the macro scale, how words agree and their syntax, the order they appear in, but also on the micro scale, what different letters are doing differently. Before we get to the micro level, recognizing the patterns that different letters create, let's spend just a few more minutes at the macro level, recognizing the patterns that words create. If I say, Vayomer Elohim el Moshe, you probably know, and maybe even without thinking, that it means, and God said to Moses. What's the verb? Vayomer. What's the subject? Elohim. Preposition el, proper noun, object of the preposition, Moshe. God said to Moses. The subject precedes the verb in English, God said, but the verb comes before the subject in the Hebrew phrase, Vayomer Elohim. Let's work through a biblical verse together in just that way. Genesis 17:3. We'll read it out loud, and then I want you to take a minute to scope out what's going on. Which are the verbs? Which are the nouns? How do the words fit together? Here we go. Vayipol Avram al panav, vaydaber ito Elohim lemor. Lemor, saying, introducing direct speech. From Aleph Mem Resh, the same root as Vayomer. Why did we split this verse into two pieces? And why did we split it where we did? Answer, the punctuation mark under the nun of panav. That mark, I'll remind you, is called an etnachta, and it splits a biblical verse into two parts. In this case, we would call them verse 3a and verse 3b. A and B are modern terms, of course. Now, which of these words are verbs? Vayipol and vayadaber. Verbs start both halves of the verse. How about the subjects of these verbs? He is built into each verb, third masculine singular, in case there isn't an explicit subject, but often there is one. And here, who did these verbs? Abram blanked, Vayipol Avram, and God blanked, Vaydaber Elohim. But ito comes in between that subject and that verb. What is it? The O suffix must be him or it. What's it attached to? You remember from last time that when et with suffixes marks a direct object, it becomes ot. He saw him vayar oto. When et means with, it stays in its regular vowel category, ito. God blanked with him. Now about the word order. A pronoun likes to bump its way ahead of a noun, even if the noun is the subject, which you'd expect to see first, and even if the subject is God, who also likes to move to the front of the line grammatically. Vaydaber ito Elohim, moving the words around to fit our English syntax, and God blanked with him. Lemor, saying. What happened before that? Abram did some other verb. Vayipol Avram, al, on or upon, panav. We already know all the parts of this word, so if you're very, very clever, you've already figured it out. Bonus points. If you know this chapter and can deduce what must be happening, you may have been able to reverse engineer the Hebrew and you figured it out that way. Bonus points to you too. But now let's talk our way through it. Panav is the object of a preposition, so it's got to be a noun. It has that av ending that we learned last time, so it's got to be his something. And because that ending is used only with plurals, that something must be a noun that ends with im. If it ended with ot, you would see ot in the word. His panav are his panim. And what are panim? Remember Al Pnei Hamayim of Genesis 1:2, the surface, but literally the face of the water. Panim is a plural noun in Hebrew that's the equivalent of our English singular word, face. Abram blanked on his face, Vayipol Avram al panav. And our last task as we look at this verse, what does Vayipol mean? To name our task more specifically, what is the root of this verb? Remember that we're always looking for three consonants, a triliteral root, to be able to understand what verb we're reading. Vaydaber is an easy one. The Vav means and, the Yud tells us that a he is doing it, and there are three letters left, Dalet Bet Resh. This comes from ledaber, to speak. But what about Vayipol? By this stage, you would already have known that it means and he somethinged. The Va and the Yud tell us that, but what's the root? I only see two consonants, Pei and Lamed. I need three. More precisely, you need three, because I will not always be around to hold your hand. You need to be able to look up words in the dictionary. And when the word is a verb, you'll need to be able to figure out that three-letter root in order to look it up. Now, I know what this verb means, but even if I didn't, I could figure out the root of the verb because I know how Hebrew letters behave. Lamed is an extremely well-behaved letter. When I see a lamed in a verb, I know it's one of the root letters. Remember Hallelu from Psalm 150? Praise him. Hallelu, there's that third masculine singular suffix as the object of a verb. And the root of the verb is Hey, Lamed, Lamed. So in Vayipol, I know that Lamed is the last letter, the third letter of the root. Now that Pei. How does a Pei behave? Pei is a Beged Kefet letter, one of those 6 letters, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Kaf, Pei, Taf, that take a dagesh whenever there's no vowel immediately before them. Panim, face, the Pei starts the word, no vowel before it, so there's a dagesh. Al panav, the last thing before the Pei is the lamed of al, a consonant, so there's a dagesh in it. But in that mnemonic, to remember the 6 letters, Beged Kefet, there's an e vowel immediately before the Pei, so there's no dagesh in it. That's the Beged Kefet rule. They only take that automatic dagesh if there's no vowel immediately before the letter. That's how Beged Kefet letters behave. What about Vayipol? There is a vowel immediately before the Pei. So this can't be a Beged Kefet dagesh. This is a strong dagesh, a dagesh chazak, a dagesh forte, a dagesh that is telling me something. The Pei of this verb is doubled. Why? Is the root here Pei, Lamed? No. It's a rule in Hebrew, in fact in all Semitic languages, that we don't identify a root as beginning with a repeated letter. Some other consonant is mimicking a Pei, has turned itself into a Pei. What kind of letter behaves like that? Nun behaves like that. You already know from our study of the preposition min, from, that a nun that's right next to another consonant likes to assimilate to that consonant. As we saw, the N sound does that in all kinds of languages, certainly in our own English language, and it does it in Hebrew too. So this verb would have been vayinpol, but the nun assimilated to the Pei and disappeared into that dagesh. Vayipol. That's how nuns behave, which means that in a number of words, and it's especially important to look for this in verbs, nun will be a root letter, but no N sound will appear in the word. Once you realize that, you can be on the lookout for it. As in this root, nun pe lamed, to fall. Abram fell on his face. Let's have a look at another example. Genesis 2:8. Vayita Adonai Elohim gan be'eden. Vayita, the verb, the subject, Adonai Elohim, the Lord God. Gan, object of the verb, a garden, where? Be'eden, in Eden. What did God do to this garden? Va, ye, tet with a dagesh, ayin. What's the root? Tet is not a beged kefet letter, so I know automatically this is a strong dagesh, a meaningful dagesh, and it must be hiding a nun. In this pattern, two root letters with a dagesh in the first one, the real first radical is a nun. So the root of this verb is nun tet ayin, which means to plant. Vayita Adonai Elohim gan be'eden, and the Lord God planted a garden in Eden. No N sound in this verb, but I know how nuns behave, so I can spot what the root must be and then look it up under the missing nun. Question: if Hebrew verbs are so regular, if the patterns are so repetitive, then if nun pe lamed produces vayipol, in the same situation, why doesn't nun tet ayin produce vayito? Answer: because ayin is a guttural, meaning that its sound was originally produced back near your throat. And gutturals may be the most ornery group of consonants in the Hebrew language. They are very demanding. Fortunately, if you know what their demands are, then you know what you're looking at. So let's sit down at the table with the guttural letters and prepare to hear their non-negotiable demands. Which letters are the gutturals? The letters Aleph, He, Chet, and Ayin. As we'll see, Resh sometimes likes to pretend it's a guttural, and Aleph has some independent characteristics of its own, but He, Chet, and Ayin will always work essentially the same way. Rule 1 for gutturals: you can't put a dagesh in a guttural or a resh. Refresher on the Hebrew definite article, it's He with a patach plus a dagesh in the next letter. Yeled, a child. Ha yeled, the child, with a dagesh in the yud. But ish, a man. Ha ish, the man, with a kamatz and no dagesh. Same thing with ha'ir, the city. Harosh, the head. Why? Because you can't put a dagesh in a guttural or resh. Often, not always, but often the language compensates by lengthening the previous vowel instead. That's rule number 1 for gutturals, no dagesh. Rule number 2 for gutturals: they don't like simple shva. Let me demonstrate. Eretz and melech are both nouns that have exactly the same linguistic shape. Same vowel pattern, same accent pattern, even though Eretz is feminine and melech is masculine. Let's look at them in the plural. Kol hamelachim, all the kings. Bechol ha'aratzot, in all the countries. The plural of both words has shva, kamatz, and then an im or ot plural ending. But look at that shva. Under the mem of melachim, a simple shva. Under the aleph of aratzot, a compound shva. If you want to review those, go back to lesson 3 where we discuss the vowels. But that's guttural rule number 2. Gutturals prefer compound shva. Rule number 3 for gutturals, and specifically the gutturals He, Chet, and Ayin, We'll talk more about Aleph in a minute. Hey, Chet, and Ayin love the vowel patach. Let's take a quick dip in Yam HaMelach, the salt sea, what we call the Dead Sea. Don't get confused between melech with a kaf, king, and melach with a chet, salt. I'm here to tell you that melach also has the same linguistic shape as melech and eretz, which we'll learn about in a future lecture. How can I say that when there's an a vowel in melach, but not in melech or eretz? Because chet is a guttural and overrides the pattern to make that vowel a patach. In fact, when hey, chet, or ayin is the last letter in a word, the preceding vowel must be an a vowel. Either the vowel that was originally there changes to an a vowel, or they just jam an extra patach in, 2 vowels in a row, which is impossible in any other circumstance. Here are some examples to compare. Va yishmor otanu, va yishlach otam Moshe. Va yishmor and va yishlach are both obviously and he blanked. They're both followed by et with a pronominal suffix marking the direct object. He blanked otanu, us, otam, them. And the Numbers verse has a subject, Moshe. Moses did it. What's the difference between vayishmor and vayishlach? Vayishlach ends in a chet, so the vowel can't be an o. It's got to be an a patach. Vayishmor otanu, he guarded us or kept us. Vayishlach otam, he sent them. 2 verb forms with exactly the same linguistic pattern, even though they sound a little different. Now, another form of those same 2 verbs, hashomer, the guarder or the guard, hasholeach, the sender. Hashomer, but not hasholech. It's hasholeach. That's actually called a furtive patach because the language furtively inserts it immediately after the previous vowel where no extra vowel should go. In some fonts, it looks like it's directly under the chet or the ayin or the hey, but don't be fooled. It's actually pronounced before the chet. Let me remind you what we're trying to learn here and all through this lesson. Trying to learn how letters behave. When you learn how letters behave, you can ignore their bad behavior. Why would you want to do that? So you can recognize that vayishmor and vayishlach, or hashomer and hasholeach, are exactly the same verb pattern. You want to be able to look past the differences that don't matter to see the patterns that do. All right, now, Aleph. The other gutturals, hey, chet, and ayin, like to have a patach nearby, but Aleph likes to have a segol, an vowel. Let's look at our old friend Elohim. I should probably say Abraham's friend Elohim, for an example. Under the Aleph, compound shva instead of simple shva, but not an a the way it would be with the other gutturals. It's an eh. And the same thing will often happen with verbs. Sneak preview from our next lesson, yishmor, he will guard, tishmor, you will guard, nishmor, we will guard, eshmor, I will guard. Why is it E with a yud, taf, or nun, but with an aleph? Same verb form, but alephs like segols. That's all there is to it. Once you know that, you can see through it. And something else that's peculiar to aleph, we no longer pronounce aleph or ayin anywhere in a word. But as I told you way back when, historically those consonants were pronounced. And that's how they're treated in the text of the Bible as we have it today, with the vowel points recorded in the early Middle Ages. They're treated as if they were pronounced. But there's one exception. Aleph at the end of a syllable is already treated in the text of the Bible as if it were not pronounced. So, another sneak preview of next time, Shamar, he kept, Amar, he said, Shalach, he sent, all with exactly the same kamatz patach vowel pattern, but bara, he created. Remember Bereshit bara Elohim? And kara, he called, velachoshech kara laila. Both have a kamatz as the second vowel. Why? Aleph at the end of a syllable is silent, so that's not a closed syllable anymore. A short a vowel, patach, that's closed off by a consonant, becomes an open, long a vowel, a kamatz, because aleph at the end of a syllable is already treated in the text of the Bible as if it were not a consonant at all. Bottom line, the vowel is different, but those verb forms are exactly the same. Look through the superficial difference to see the underlying similarity. All right, we're in the home stretch now, but there are still two more examples, two more categories of consonants behaving badly that we have to look at. I shouldn't really say badly, because these are consonants that are behaving as it's natural for them to do. They behave in these ways very reliably. So as long as we learn what they're going to do, we can live with it. And these next two examples are difficult because difficult consonants, because Hebrew tries to force them to do something that's a little bit unnatural for them. And they resist. It all has to do with the history of the Semitic languages and with the way certain roots are treated in Hebrew. Here we go. The first kind is roots that begin with a yud. In some of these, it's a yud in all the Semitic languages, but in a lot of them, most of them, the root begins with yud only in Hebrew. In the other Semitic languages, those roots begin with a vav. The sound v in Hebrew is the word and, that conjunction that we see over and over again. So Hebrew doesn't like other words to begin with a vav. With the exception of a few names, there are only two. Vav itself, which means hook, and valad, which means a child. All the other words beginning with vav that made their way into Hebrew begin with a yud instead of a vav. Remember, hayeled, the child, from earlier in this lesson, occurs 89 times in the Bible, but valad only occurs once, Genesis 11:30. They're obviously related, but in Hebrew, the original vav is forced to show up as a yud. But that's only when it's at the beginning of the word. In words where the first root letter is not always the first letter of the form, that yud can revert to being a vav. And not only a consonantal vav, a V sound, but even an O or U vowel. Moledet, your homeland, is another noun from the root yud lamed dalet. And where's the yud? It reverted to being a vav. And the vav expresses itself as an O sound. That O of moledet, homeland, is the yud of yud lamed dalet. At the other end of the word, let's talk about hey as the third root letter. Not hey with a mapik, the guttural letter, because that mapik is bringing out the sound of the hey and telling you this is a real consonant. But plain hey, hey that's just telling you to say a vowel at the end of the word. That hey isn't always a root letter, but when it is standing in for a yud. remember that yud at the end of a Hebrew word could be expected to mean my or me, especially before the vowel points were invented, which is to say, for the first couple of thousand years of the language. So that kind of yud changes into hey at the end of a word. But when that hey isn't at the end of the word, it can turn back into the original root letter yud or simply disappear. Much more on that too in a future lecture, but for now, let's just contrast the good with the beautiful. I feel like Aristotle. Good is tov, beautiful is yafeh. When you do see that segol hey, you know for sure that the third radical, the last letter of the root, is hey. Let's compare. Good, tov, tova, tovim, tovot. Beautiful, not yafhim and yafhot, but yafeh, yafa, yafim, yafot. Tova, tovim, tovot. Yafeh, yafa, yafim, yafot. And finally, two more cases where yud and vav can turn from consonants into vowels. For yud, when you hear the sound ayi, as in bayit, a house, it can change into a, as in beit. Ha-bayit, the house, beit ha-melech, the house of the king, the palace. And with vav, the sound aveh, as in tavech, can change into o, as in toch. Ba tavech, in the middle, betoch hagan, in the middle of the garden. All right, let's take a quick look at Genesis 1:18, day 4 of creation, to get our heads back in the story. Why did God create the sun and the moon? To shine on the earth, ve limshol bayom uvalayla, ulehavdil bein haor uvein hachoshech. And what happened? Vayar Elohim ki tov. Limshol be, to govern over, from memshin lamed, like memshelet of verse 16. Bayom uvalayla, over the day and the night. Ulehavdil, and to separate, like vayavdel of verse 4. Bein haor uvein hachoshech, between the light and the darkness. Vayar Elohim ki tov, and God saw that it was good. All right, that's a lot, so I have a couple of recommendations. First, have a look at the section in the course guidebook that summarizes all this information. As I said, you may want to bookmark it. Second, go to Numbers 22 and put your new knowledge to work. The official challenge this time is to find every case where the guttural letters hey, chet, and ayin appear at the end of a word. Remember that hey at the end of a word is not a guttural unless it has a mapik. And if you can spot any of the other cases that we talked about today, more power to you. Finally, as I said, in our next lesson, we're going to learn the perfect and the imperfect forms of the verb systematically. This is a good time to go back to Lecture 1 and start the course over again. You'll be amazed at what you already know, the things that seem obvious to you now that definitely weren't when we got started. But you'll also be amazed at the things from those earlier lessons that you weren't ready to learn the first time through, but you are now. Pay special attention to the verbs in those lessons we've already done, and you'll be in top-notch shape for next time. See you then.